colleagues from different mediation centers around the state. And our interest in coming to this conference was to really talk with you all who are doing amazing things in your communities, and to let you know the resources available in your own communities in terms of mediation and conflict resolution, and also give you a sense of what that kind of work is. So my name's Christina, and I work up in Clackamas County. I coordinate a youth and family mediation program. So I work with youth and families, helping them resolve their conflicts. Welcome.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out where to put it.
There's space over there too, and this is open.
Yeah. 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 Go ahead. Oh, thank you so much. Okay, here we go. Oops.
As I was saying, I work with families a lot, and one of the amazing things for me in terms of working with families in a mediation context is just the transformation that families go through in terms of coming in kind of sometimes entrenched in ways of interacting that can be very destructive, both personally and in terms of a family unit, and see people walk out with some new ideas about ways that they can work together, work around these issues, and troubleshoot them. And we also work with youth in the schools, trying to teach some conflict resolution skills as well, and just hopefully broadening their way of viewing the world, that it doesn't have to be so adversarial, that when people do come together to constructively resolve conflicts, they come out feeling more whole as people and as a community. So,
and your name is?
Oh, my name is Christina. Did I forget to mention that? I'm Christina.
Christine and I work together in Clackamas County up in Portland, and my name is Amy Cleary, and I'm the mediation coordinator for the community program up there. Clackamas County actually has 3 mediation programs within its boundaries, and we run the community mediation program. Christine is involved in the Family Court Services mediation program that does divorce mediation, youth and family. And then there's a separate mediation program with the juvenile court system that deals with juvenile offenders who have committed a crime, and they bring the victim and offender together in a voluntary way. And Ted will talk a little bit more about that. But the community work that we do typically involves neighbor-to-neighbor issues, and many times you'll see people who are afraid to talk to their neighbor or unwilling to approach their neighbor for one reason or another. And I think part of that is because communities are somewhat transient, and people come and go, and so you might not know your neighbor as well as you might hope. So people have issues sometimes that are difficult to even approach in terms of having a conversation. But there are things like boundary line disputes, property maintenance, barking dogs, peacocks, roosters. Clackamas County has urban and rural populations, so we deal with all sorts of different kinds of things. But the mediation process allows us to give them a safe, predictable environment within which to have difficult conversations. So we'll talk more about that, and the work within community. We do individual mediation, but we also do larger group mediations, and I'll be talking a little bit later about an example of a community-wide mediation that I helped with recently, so we'll be talking about that.
Great. I am Ted Lewis. I guess I'm the local yokel here from Eugene, and I'm part of Community Mediation Services, which is a counterpart to the one up in Clackamas that Amy and Christina have described. It's been around since 1981, 25 years, so it's been here for a long time. The agency has had a low profile. It's always been doing good work, but we're doing more and more to be more present in Lane County. And the part that I am mostly involved in is with victims and offenders coming together and community members. It's very rewarding work. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I've been involved in this work for about 10 years. And one of the things I really like about being in victim offender mediation work is you can actually see both sides get new impressions of each other when they really focus on the harms and have a chance to build some empathy toward each other. It paves the way for them to really have a discussion to bring resolution and deeper healing, deeper understanding, amends, restitution, because real people are coming together and putting a face on crime. So I am thankful to be part of that work. And I think we all wanted to say just some tiny bits about what really is mediation. And one thing that I think is really important in the way I look at mediation is bridge work. Think of building bridges between people who don't have good communication opportunities, or there's some sort of obstacles that prevent them from having their own resources to come together and discuss things to bring about resolution. So a neutral third party comes together as a caring person, a supportive person, to help create the bridge work of good communication. And what we're really doing is we're empowering parties to determine their own solutions. And they don't have to rely on other professionals to determine outcomes. We're really evoking the best within people to determine their own outcomes. I don't know if you guys want to add a little bit to what is mediation. But
I think in terms of metaphors, the bridge is an analogy that I really associate with mediation. The other thing I associate with it is space. I think in a couple of different ways. One, we as mediators create a space for those bridges to be built. And I think also we create a space for new ways of looking at things and holding things differently. I think sometimes we get very locked into our positions when we're in a conflict with somebody, and having a physical space to explore new ways often provides us a mental space to think outside of the box as well. And so I associate a lot with that space.
Mm-hmm. And I think, too, that one of the things that we do as mediators is model good communication skills and really putting those into practice and slowing a conflict down enough so that people can think about what it is they're trying to accomplish and make choices about the way they communicate with each other so that they have a better opportunity to try and work together collaboratively. Blank space in my brain.
yeah. We're curious to know how many of you might have had a chance in the past to be part of a mediation experience. Any of you? How many know of someone else that went through a process, whether it went well? So it looks like in some respects you're familiar with mediation. How many of you is this really kind of brand new? Like, wow, what is mediation? You there? Okay. Well, we're happy you're here, because what we really want to do is present sort of the essence of what mediation is, and we also want to point to some new directions as to how mediation might grow into other areas and expand beyond maybe some of the traditional realms. So I think that's where we kind of want to end up, is how might these bridge building models be applied in some new areas.
One of the places that has sort of, one of the focuses that has sort of shifted, at least in our county and I think in many others, is that traditionally people are used to solving their problems through enforcement and calling somebody to say, I need to have you come in and tell this person not to do this thing, whether it's an attorney or a judge or a policeman or a code enforcement officer. And people really have traditionally looked at that whole process of solving a dispute by calling somebody and asking them to take care of it. But mediation asks them to really be part of the solution and come together with people so that they can creatively come up with ideas and solutions that are going to work best for them. Because in an enforcement situation, the problem doesn't necessarily get addressed. Somebody may make a determination and it might not really serve either of the parties' needs or interests. And so at least in our county, the Code Enforcement Division and the Sheriff's Department and actually dog control have made a very conscious effort to give people the opportunity to come to mediation rather than go through enforcement, because it can build community with people when they have those conversations and really get to know one another well enough so that they can come up with ideas that are going to work for both of them. And the solutions that they come up with are typically more long-lasting. And so these enforcement agencies don't get the repeat calls from the people who are still mad at each other and just coming up with new issues. So that's something that mediation can really do. It's a community building tool.
So with that, what we'd like to do today is, since each of us work in different realms of mediation, we'd like to present 3 cases that we've actually had, and to give you a sense of both what it looks like in real terms with real people, and also as an entree into hopefully you're looking at these conflicts as well and seeing what they might have in common. So we're going to start off with the vignette, and then we're going to examine that a little bit and hopefully open that up to discussion a little bit to you all and talk about some conflict theory. And then we're going to continue with those vignettes, the rest of the stories, and then open it up again for you guys.
Okay. So I'm going to start by talking about more of a public policy kind of a mediation that I worked on last spring. And the case came to me from 3 different places, which was kind of interesting because usually we just get one referral. But I got a phone call from an attorney that was working with a group and knew about this conflict. I got another phone call from one of the secretaries of a board of one of the groups that was in conflict, and I got a phone call from the Board of County Commissioners who knew about the conflict between these 2 groups. And they all 3 were saying, would you be willing to work on this? So I said I would be happy to do that, and needed the names of the people who were sort of leading the groups, and looking for the stakeholders, trying to figure out who the people were that would need to be at the table to have a rich and meaningful discussion. So there were 2 different groups of people that had gathered around something called Villages and Hamlets applications. And these things had come out of a process that the county's been involved in for, 8 to 10 years, where they've had a community dialogue around complete communities. And they really wanted to get people involved in thinking about how they wanted to develop Clackamas County over time. What things do you value about your community? What is it that you'd like to see? What are the issues you want to see the county system working on, and that kind of thing. So they came up with this idea that if they created some governance structure for communities in unincorporated areas, not cities, because they already had their own structure, but in the unincorporated areas, that would give people an opportunity to speak up about things that were important to them and make recommendations to the Board of Clackamas County Board of Commissioners. So they put together this whole construct of 2 different options, and the village option had some degree of taxation that if everybody within that area voted for it, they could tax themselves to do systems infrastructure and that kind of thing. And then the hamlet was a government structure, but it didn't have the ability to tax. It could raise money through nonprofit efforts and those kinds of things. But it's a subtle difference between these 2 groups. But generally what happened was there's an area called the Stafford Triangle, and these 2 groups were coming out of this area trying to move forward with their separate applications. And they saw each other as the developers and the environmentalists. And that's kind of how they ended up stereotyping each other. And so over the course of years, they built up this animosity between the 2 groups. And it played out in this mediation that we did as we were trying to get them to decide which application was going to move forward. They both had submitted their applications for these governance structures on the same day. And the Clackamas County Commissioners didn't want to make this decision. So they sent them to mediation, and they asked them to work it through and see if they could make a decision about which application was going to move forward. So when these people came into the room, they were squared off. There were 6 people on one side who represented a board and 6 people on the other side who represented a board, and they all had very different ideas about what they thought should happen in their Stafford Triangle. So that's how I saw them. That's how they came to me, and I can tell you more about the story later. But that's just kind of the overview of the conflict. Okay.
My story involves a 17-year-old young man in a rural part of Lane County. And the story begins where he and another teen were driving very fast on a rainy night through a rural town, back and forth, speeding. And an older man was very concerned about safety issues and turned them in, and the police caught up with them and cited them. And it so happened that when the young man went to court, to have to rectify fines and things like that, he found out who the older man was that had turned him in. So he and his friend developed a revenge kind of mode of responding to this whole situation. And that stewed and brewed for quite some time. And eventually, these young guys made a choice. They found out where this other man had lived. He had rural property with a long driveway, kind of out in a wooded area. And they actually went there one night, and they went into his pickup and took a large wad of keys. I mean, we're talking, 20, 25 keys on this key ring. And they left. And they actually came back a second time, and I believe egged and did some egging around the house. They came back a third time. This is like a few weeks in between. All of this again at night, dark time. On the third time, they actually drove the pickup away, and they went to a county park where there was a body of water. Eventually, the police caught up with the whole situation. And one boy was 17, who I'm going to follow through with, and the other was 19, who went down a very different legal path. And it's always been interesting for me to compare the two paths, because the younger boy had a chance to go through our restorative justice program, which ultimately means the possibility of a face-to-face dialogue with the victim party. Whereas the other one went through more of a conventional route, never had that personal contact, never had any personal information, and had to do some fines and things like that. So what we do is we do preparation meetings. We have a preparation meeting with an offender to really check in to see what his or her attitude is, get their story, what's their level of ownership, are they appropriate to really, go toward a dialogue. And in this case, several months later, this young man really was. He felt very bad about choices he made, and it was bothering him, and he was willing to make some amends. He even said, we have a second car, and if he needs that. So he was already quite far along in terms of his own capacity to have some empathy, which sometimes in our meetings is what becomes a catalyst for building that. And then I checked in with the victim party, and I'll never forget this, because I called him in the evening once, and I was home, and my daughters were trying to get my attention, and I locked myself in the bathroom, and this guy vented for like 15 minutes straight. He was angry, he was mad. No, victim services is just about next to nothing in Lane County in terms of resources, so he had no real follow-up. This was his work vehicle. His keys involved work keys from a school. He had sports equipment in that vehicle. It caused hassles and stresses, so he was venting on all of this. And then when he found out it could go through mediation, it even made him more mad. Like, what's this about, And he wanted, some real accountability here. And, everything was just tense and unresolved for him. And all I could do was just let him pour that out, because he really hadn't had an ear yet to do that. Finally, I said, it sounds like you really want this guy to be held accountable in relation to how you've been affected. And he said, yeah, that's it. And I said, well, that's kind of the bullseye of what our program really aims for. And he said, well, then I'm all for it. When do we meet? And he heard something there about connecting justice to his experience, his needs. And so he was ready to enter into a dialogue process. And so after all the preparation, we had a full 2-hour meeting in a rural county, and I'll come to that in my next bit.
So my story is about a mother and a daughter. And daughter is about 17, has an older sister who's 19, who graduated from high school, went away to college, didn't like being away from home so much, so came back. So it's the 3 of them in a household. And I get a call from mom saying, I'd like to come to mediation with my 17-year-old daughter. She's no longer living at home, and she wants to come back, but she can't come back under the same circumstances that she left. Mom described her as a very sort of selfish, snobby person with a lot of attitude. The only thing that ever resulted in any kind of communication that mom and daughter had was yelling and fighting. Daughter came home and she would lock herself up in a room and not be integrated into the family at all. Anytime they'd go to family gatherings, daughter and boyfriend would always be off in the corner, not interacting with anybody else in the family. Mom and the older daughter got along really well. She said, she's a good kid. She does well in school. She's involved in school, but she's just terrible to be around. And I think she hates us. She hates me and her older sister, and we just can't get through to her. And we can't have her back in the house if we keep fighting the way we're fighting. It's not a place that we want to live. It's not the kind of family we want to have. So she's on her own until she can come back a different person. And so daughter, she said daughter was staying with friends, and then something happened there, and then she had to move on to other friends. And she said she only has a year left of school. She needs to finish school. She wants to come back, but she can't come back unless under these circumstances. So we schedule a mediation. Mom and daughter come. Mom tells her story again in the mediation, which is much like what I just described. And then daughter has a chance to tell her story. And daughter says, it's not about me at all, it's about the 2 of you. And I only see my boyfriend every other week because we live in Oregon City and he lives in Salem. I don't get to spend that much time with him. I'm always responsible for cleaning up every mess that I make. It's my sister who never does the work. That's the source of contention in the house. And just kind of burst out in tears.
So these are 3 realms where conflict can happen and where obviously mediation can happen. And certainly there are other realms. I mean, if we think of a continuum, we have sort of the micro level of personal and family and neighborhood. And then if we go to the macro level, we're all very aware of what's going on globally in terms of needs and interests that are frustrated between large groups of people, and it's resulting in all sorts of violence and other issues. So somewhere in there, we find ourselves concerned about conflicts, and we find ourselves involved as participants in conflict. Certainly, people who are concerned about social issues, concerned about the future, which is really at the heart of Pioneers, will find themselves in conversations with other people where there's some hot issues that come up. And you might find yourself feeling some uncomfortable feelings when you're dealing with conversations with other people that totally disagree with you, and you feel like if they kind of have their sway over time, it's really going to frustrate certain visions for the future. And I know for myself, when I'm in those hot potato kinds of conversations with people that are near me or even relatives, I get certain physical symptoms. And I start, sometimes I'm not that aware of it till later, but I know that I get, I can feel it in certain parts of my body. And I just want you to take some time right now, think back in some conflicts you've had just in conversations with other people over certain issues that can become kind of hot button issues for you. I want you to think about where do you feel physical reactions in your own body in some of those kinds of conversations. Just we'll have some silence for you to think about that. Now, sort of a next level for this discussion, which I find really interesting, is we could probably all be in conversations today if it's the right issue, kind of the right person that kind of pushes our buttons, we would have those physical symptoms today. But chances are, there are some topics for us where we can be pretty calm on. We probably wouldn't have these physical symptoms, but maybe we did 10, 15 years back. Does that resonate for people? So the real interesting question is, what happened for you to be able to journey over 10, 15 years so that the same topic could come up and somehow you're more relaxed and able to kind of be there without those physical and emotional symptoms? What happened? And part of where we're going with this exercise is, as you become more mindful of how you respond to conflict, how you respond to hot issues, you then have more of a capacity to make choices in how you engage with people in conflict resolution. Without that mindfulness, we kind of have these default levels. You said fight or flight, was it? You know, we have these default levels of dealing with conflict, but that mindfulness of our reactions actually leads us to kind of a higher plane of then tuning into the other person, approaching things from a different angle, asking questions that might kind of diffuse the situation. As mediators, we're sort of in love with this topic, because what we're doing is we're creating spaces for people to come together that already have these physical and emotional intensities about them, and we have to do things to kind of help them get to a place where they're not going to upstage good communication. And so just being aware of those processes is kind of part of our sort of shop talk for us, even though probably on other levels we're going to have our buttons pushed and we're as human as the next person too.
And I think it's important. I've heard power come up twice, and I think that one of the challenges for us as mediators is to do our best to empower both parties and to perceive where and when there is an imbalance, and to be conscious of that. Because I think when you're talking about creating a safe space for people, there needs to be a sense of self-determination on each of the parties' part to be able to participate in a process like that. And sometimes mediation isn't appropriate when that balance is really out of scale. I wondered about that. So I think those are good points and things that we as mediators have to be aware of. And those can be whole communities too, you know, that can be out of imbalance. But there are tools, as Amy keeps referring to bring those parties into balance.
Well, let's finish our stories.
Are you curious about how they ended?
So the group that I worked with ended up coming to an agreement, and they did that over the course of about 6 meetings, where we met in the evening for 2.5 hours each time. And in the beginning, as I said, they had come together as 2 different factions. And the thing they had in common was that they cared about this area. They cared about this triangle of unincorporated area that was bordered by different cities. And they were afraid that the cities were going to begin to annex bits and pieces of their unincorporated area, that they wouldn't have any control over that. They were worried about, one of the primary things they were worried about was the metro-urban growth boundary. And as that moves out, it requires certain densities, housing densities, and they were looking forward into the future, thinking that it was going to be that boundary was going to be moved out into their area in the next year or 2. And they knew from experience that they wouldn't have a voice in any of these development decisions if they didn't have some sort of a organized community within their own group. So they had the same goal in mind, which made it much easier for me, because once, they knew they had the same goal in mind, they just disagreed on how they were going to get there. So it helped out that they were willing to come to mediation first off. We negotiated who was going to be participating, and then 12 people showed up on the first evening and spent a lot of time really trying to negotiate around just the whole idea of trusting one another. And it probably took us into the third or fourth session before they really felt like they had established enough trust that they could work on an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding. Go ahead.
Were these people who knew each other real well, or? They
knew each other, and they had lived most of them had lived in the community for quite a while. The environmentalists, as they had been stereotyped, were pretty much people who had small parcels of property. They were living in single-family homes. They had been maybe in the area for a long time. But not necessarily. Some people hadn't lived there quite as long, but they all had this pride of ownership around being in this particular area, because it's very rural, and it is boundaried by West Lynn and Lake Oswego and Oregon City and Tualatin, and so it's kind of a little oasis. And then the other group, people characterize as the developers, and these were people who had larger parcels of land and might be thinking about selling them off for subdivisions or for developing mini malls or some sort of business mixed use kind of thing. And admittedly, there were those ideas in the backs of people's minds in terms of what the future was going to hold as they moved forward. Some people did want to sell off their property and make some money and develop it, but they had to find the common ground that they needed in order to work together, because the whole idea ended up being, how are we going to come to a common vision about this, and then how are we going to communicate that out to people who might be making the decisions for us, because they're still only going to be able to make recommendations even with this governance structure that they're putting together. But they felt if they had a voice as residents of this area, and they could work together to move an idea forward, that Metro would listen to them, and Clackamas County would listen to them, and the cities that were surrounding them would listen to them. But if they didn't have that, they wouldn't have a voice. So that was their common ground. And there had been a lot of kind of negative press over a period of time. You asked if they knew each other. There had been negative press between the two leaders who had moved petitions forward. So they were the chief petitioners. And they had been sort of set up in this role of having this conflict, and they kept coming back into the local newspapers about what was going on in Stafford, so that people were reading about this conflict over time, and it kind of took on a life of its own in the press. So once they got to the point where they were beginning to find ways of collaborating together, one of the issues that they dealt with is, how are we going to deal with the press? Who's going to talk to the press? And so they negotiated that. They negotiated which application are we going to move forward. They finally, probably in maybe the fourth or fifth meeting, decided that they were going to go with a hamlet application. And the people on the village side did that as a concession. They said, it's not that important to us that we have a village application, but we do feel like we all need to work together. So we're willing to go with the hamlet application. And what that meant was that they were all going to need to go back. They were going to need to go back to the people who signed their petition and explain to them why now they were wanted to be hamlet petitioners. So, but they were willing to do that. So then that started building trust between these two groups, and the hamlet group said, okay, great, we'll make some concessions. So they began to build this agreement, and they memorialized it in a memorandum of understanding, which was really for the group themselves. And that helped them to get to the point where they could say, we agree to move forward with one application, we're all going to stand behind it. So then the next step for them was to go to the commissioners and to let them know that they'd made a decision. So they came out of that mediation process, as I said, it was about six sessions over a period of time, with this document that showed the commissioners that they were united and that they were going to be able to work together. So the commissioners were very happy with that. And then they had beyond that, they had a process that they were going to engage in to develop the hamlet. So now they're actually in that process where they're having town meetings, and they're electing a board and people are participating in developing bylaws and all that kind of thing. So this is an ongoing thing that they're doing. But because they went through mediation, they were able to find an opportunity to work together and to decide what their priorities were and what was going to motivate them. And they are one group now, and they brought this whole community in with them so that they could pass the leadership on if that's what people wanted. They didn't want to necessarily be the leaders, but they wanted to be able to move the community forward and being able to develop this unity. So that was the happy ending to the story. And there's, as I said, they're still in process. It's working well.
If you walk away with anything today, is that real peacekeeping, real peace building cannot happen without real relationship. So that certainly happened in the resolution with my case. 2 hours, the older man and his wife came, the 17-year-old and his father came, and I was able to help facilitate pretty powerful conversation. I know early on that if parties are making direct eye contact with each other, I can sort of back up a little bit and let that conversation happen. If they've been well prepared and know what to expect, and I've forecasted things, I can kind of pull out of the way, because I'm just there to create a safe opportunity, which couldn't have happened otherwise, for them to really come together on their own. And without that direct eye contact, what happens is parties will make eye contact with the mediator, and then they're sort of checking in with a mediator or facilitator to really get a sense of bearings and trust, and then eventually they can look at each other. I separate our meetings into 3 stages. We talk about the sort of the story part of what happened, and we talk about the impacts, and we talk about the resolution and journey through those 3 stages. And so early on, the young man just told his story of what he did and why he did it. And then he read an apology letter that he had written ahead of time. Pretty lengthy one. He read through the whole thing and then reached way across and handed it to the man. And it was a very powerful gesture. It was his way of saying, I have been thinking about this. And then the victim had a chance to talk about his story. He just kind of laid it out, and there were a lot of additional anxieties and stresses that he talked about, and his wife talked about it, his losses, and the ripple effects of mistrust in the community and what it's like, to feel violated when someone comes onto your property. And he just went on and on, but in a way that was really wanting the young man to hear things and wasn't demeaning at all in the way he was saying it. He really wanted to see something positive come out of this. And when we got into the resolution discussion, good hour and a half in, so you can imagine how much detail and stuff comes up, what's going on at this point and this point. Victims have a lot of questions to kind of make sense out of something if they haven't had that information earlier. But once there's a fullness around that discussion, we got into the resolution, and they came up as parties. They came up with 5 tangible, practical things that the boy could do to make amends. Some of it was paying back money. Another one was getting the keys. The keys had never been passed back, and there were several things. And then finally, I turned to the offender and I said, "Now, is there anything that you've been thinking that you want to offer as a way to make amends?" And he looked at the victim and he said, "Well, I'd be willing to come to your place and do any work for you." Now, when I first heard that, I thought, whoa, their relationship was only built on negative stuff and mistrust. Coming on the property around midnight, and that's all their relationship had been. But the first thing that the victim said was, "I got some wood out back. Need some cutting." Now that's a powerful example of how something got rebuilt on the trust level that wasn't there prior to this process. And it's always fascinated me to think about the psychology of what's going on here to allow someone to go from A to B so that now in a rural community they could actually have positive relationship where they had only negative relationship. And to me, the real test of restorative justice is if parties, after a process like that, can maybe be at each end of a supermarket on an aisle and see each other and actually come toward each other and say, how are you doing? And not feel like there's some sort of lack of closure because of the awkwardness of a failed justice process. Relationship for peacemaking.
Well, speaking of relationship, I mean, mothers and daughters have very intimate relationships, unlike in these two cases. And the mom and daughter met with us in about probably 5 or 6 mediations, an hour and a half in length. And sometimes when you tell a story like this, you think, oh, I know what they could do. You think it's a pretty easy solution. But when you see a family go through 5 sessions over the course of, probably 10 weeks, you realize that these are very complex issues, and people have a lot of processing to do, sometimes before they can establish a new kind of relationship or rebuild a relationship that had gone really bad and deteriorated. That's me. Sorry. And so what had happened over the course of really probably 5 years with mother and daughter was that mom and the older daughter are kind of the exact same people. They process things the same way. The same things are important to them. They connect on levels that mom and the younger daughter never could. Dad was really never in their life, and so mom would often make comments like, oh, you're just like your dad. Whose daughter never knew, but she knew she was different from mom and older daughter. And dad was never there. Dad was bad. So here she was being reminded that she was a bad person. She was different and bad. And she had always wanted to develop a relationship with her mom, but she never knew how to. She was the kind of person who needed somebody, her mom, to come up to her and ask her how she was doing and sit with her for a little bit before she could really start talking to her mom. And her mom thought that she just needed her space. So her mom thought she was really respecting her daughter, who wasn't like the older daughter who would always talk about things and process with mom. She was just respecting her and giving her space. And so as she gave her more and more space, daughter withdrew more and more, and they had no relationship other than a relationship built on fighting. And so each time a new sort of piece was introduced into the family, like the boyfriend, it was always a point of contention because they had lost any sort of connection to talk about who this person was or how important he was. And there was a tremendous amount of hurt on both sides, both mom and daughter, because daughter would disengage entirely and only react negatively to mom, and mom got to a point where she couldn't handle it anymore and asked her to leave. But asking her to leave just tore daughter apart because now she's no longer a part of the family. And one of the things that they established pretty early on was that their communication pattern was really negative and was more hurtful than it was productive at any given time. But they didn't necessarily know how to rebuild that communication pattern, nor could they until they had gone through this forgiveness process. Both of them, one of you talked about fear and how fear is so, we associate fear with conflict. Both of them were so scared to try to come back together and live in the same household because it was just a painful experience. So why did they want to do that? But they knew they had to. And one of the pieces that they needed to, in order to start rebuilding that relationship, was to forgive each other. And that took a couple of sessions. They were very scared to do that. Once they sort of hinted at the possibility of that happening, they didn't really know how it could happen, but they started to open up to the idea that forgiveness could take place. They could also then talk about different ways of communicating and brainstorm new ways of communicating. And one of the things that we actually did in the mediation was role play. We take a situation that had gone bad or something that they thought might go bad, where that would spiral into a fighting match between the two of them, and see if they could see what they both needed in order to engage differently. And and then see if the other person could provide that. And we role played a number of times, and then they'd go home, and sometimes daughter would go home for a day, and they'd interact, and they'd try that out, that new communication pattern. And it wasn't until they felt comfortable with that new communication pattern and practicing it that daughter was actually invited to come back and accepted to come back home. And she did.
Did you ever involve the older sister?
We did, and it was too much at the time. At a certain stage, I mean, they definitely determined that there was that triangulation factor going on. But mom, and we brought the older daughter in, I think, on the third session, and it just was too much. It was too emotional. There was too much going on. They couldn't identify, how to start moving forward productively. So older sister never came back. But I think what happened, the way that mom and daughter were able to rebuild their relationship was solid enough ground for them to work together as a threesome in the house. So it was one of those mediations where you see people who are really hurt and hurting each other, and it takes a long time to sort of open yourself back up to something that has been hurtful in the past. But they stuck it out because they knew they had to, and they both wanted to rebuild that relationship. They just didn't know how.
So you mentioned that you tried role playing. Was that an effort to help them learn how to forgive each other, or to build on the new communication style?
Build on the new communication style. Yeah.
What exercises would you try to include to encourage the forgiveness aspect?
The forgiveness. As an exercise, I don't know that I would have an exercise as much as really getting a sense of what would you need from your mom in order to be able to forgive her. Is that something that you're open to? Or what do you need to do for yourself in order to be able to forgive your mom? So more talking through what they both needed in that kind of a situation. And I think one of the things about, families and relationships and even close friends or even larger communities is we get into these patterns of interaction, and they can be very adversarial, especially when we're in conflict and we're operating in a fight mode because emotionally we want to win. And I think to be able to practice new ways of communicating, whether that's just going through multiple facilitated dialogues and practicing something in those time frames, or actually doing a role play, can really help us to get that into our system, because those patterns are hard to change otherwise when you've been so entrenched.
It sort of goes back to, when we were going through the exercise of our physical symptoms with conflict and our emotions, and then thinking about how we can be mindful of that. And with that mindfulness comes some of this awareness of communication. And I think one of the bottom lines that draws all of our examples together is we're inviting parties into a process where they can have a greater capacity to be interested in the other. Because without that, the default level is you're sort of protective. Even you as an individual in those hot potato conversations and you're tense, sometimes it's just about protecting your idea and hanging on to it, and that's important. And without that idea, the future's not going to go a certain way. And as we're able to loosen that, hold on that, not that we give up the idea, but our manner of holding it loosens up, we can have more regard for the other person, the other party. And in all three of our examples, parties journeyed to a point where they started to see the other party in a new way, in a new light, that allowed for some new bridges to be built, some new connections. Certainly this is what's happening with the Reuniting America stuff. Did everyone see that piece yesterday? And so when you just imagine those conversations happening and relationships being built, it's really about regarding the other in a deeper way than you do on kind of a quick default level.
Mediation is something that, unless you've seen it or learned about it, it's kind of nebulous, because we're up here talking about how this works, but you're thinking, well, what goes on? What does it look like? And there are, what we talk about in mediation is that in order for people to get to resolution, they need to have 3 satisfactions, and one of them is procedural. And so what we bring to the situation is a process. So there's a procedural satisfaction, then there's a substantive. That means that they've got the ability to decide what they're going to talk about, the content of what they're talking about. And then the third piece of that is the relational satisfaction. So it's procedural, substantive, and relational. And the relational piece of it is, how do you feel about how you're talking to each other about this? And when we structure mediation, we have, at least in the training that we provide, there's 5 stages. So you actually have a process that you explain to the parties before they get started in their conversation. And in the beginning, you give them an overview of the mediation process, which is going to be basically, we're going to ask you to come into the room together. When we first start out, the mediators are going to explain to you what mediation looks like. We talk about ground rules and guidelines. We make sure that everybody understands the role of the mediator as a neutral third party. They talk about housekeeping issues. How long are we going to be in the session? Where's the bathroom? Where's the water? Just so everybody knows what to expect, because you don't want any surprises. And as we go through that initial overview, it helps people to feel more comfortable about what's going to happen. They know what to expect. We also go through a confidentiality agreement and ask them to think about how this information is going to be shared with other people after the session, if at all. So they have to have the opportunity to think about, this is very key to mediation, is the confidentiality piece, because we want them to be able to feel comfortable and safe sharing the information that they're sharing between them. And the confidentiality may be that they agree that nothing's going to be confidential and anybody can walk out of the room and talk to anybody about it. And the other extreme is that everything's confidential and we're not going to share anything that we say in here with anybody else. If there's a written agreement at the end of that process, then that written agreement can be something that is shared if they choose to, or not if they choose to. And as mediators, we hold their information confidential. So we're not going to take it out and trot it around the community and let everybody know, what's going on. So we get permission if we use case examples. We get permission to use those case examples, or we use examples that are general enough so that the people who were involved aren't being, we're not talking about names and places and that kind of thing. So this process that we go through is one of education, and then letting them have the opportunity to speak directly to us first and not speak to each other in the mediation initially, because we want them to be able to talk about why they came to the mediation, what their interests and issues are, and if they're talking to the mediator, they're less likely to get engaged in that negative behavior that Christina was talking about, because they think of each other as individuals, they're positional, they're in the fight, and if they direct their conversation to each other, they're much more likely to just jump right back into it. So we ask them to speak to us directly. And then as we listen, we're listening to, first for us just a summary, why are you each here? And then the mediators begin to ask open-ended questions so that the dialogue starts to happen. And what happens during the dialogue is that they probably hear things from each other that they've never heard before. They've each got their story that they've been telling people about the conflict, or they've been thinking about the conflict, but they've never really had an opportunity to share each other's experiences. And that's where the empathy building comes in. So once you are able to go through a session of 2 to 3 hours with people having that opportunity to trust the process, to share the content, the substance of the information that they want to share with each other, it begins to transform the relational part of it, the relationship piece that they really need to restore in order to build enough trust to come to an agreement. And even in community mediation, when people still don't necessarily like each other, they can come to some behavioral agreements. They can say, okay, if you promise not to play basketball between 7 a.m. and or 10 p.m. and 7 a.m., then I can agree with that. And no, I don't want to have a barbecue with you next week, but I'd really appreciate it if you'd honor the fact that that noise really bothers me. So they can come to whatever level of agreement works for them and works for their relationship. But the end result of the mediation process is some sort of an agreement around the issues that brought them to the table.
So we're out of time, and we're ending at 3:45. I think one of the other things we wanted to pass out is information about the community resources in mediation available to you all in your communities. Each one of these centers offers a different array of services, whether public policy, restorative justice, family, neighbor to neighbor, and most of the times, if not all the times, these resources are free to the community. So if you have issues that you're interested in exploring, maybe it's a public policy issues where two different groups are warring in a community about land use or something like that, we would encourage you to contact your local center and see if they have resources available or if they could find resources available in order to engage in those dialogues. Or if your neighbors have a conflict, or if you have a conflict in your family, there really are these resources available, and we really feel like they are a community building asset for the places that we live and the people that we interact with. And sometimes, even though we're dealing with big issues, we have smaller issues that can get in the way of looking at those bigger issues from a different angle. And this kind of a process might be helpful to shift that thinking a little bit and open up the possibilities. I think just the last thing the thing that I always walk away with in conflict is that conflict can be a dangerous endeavor, or it can be an opportunity for change or an opportunity for growth. And if we engage in it in a constructive way, there's lots of possibilities there.
Even at the macro level, if you're thinking, well, what about resolving conflicts, on the global international scene? I think we would have a consensus that there still has to be a component of relationship. That you're still dealing with real people, interacting with other real people, and being sensitive to the dynamics of relating and communicating. And so, again, I really come back to this idea that relationship building through good communication is vital, whether it's at the micro level or the macro level.